supreme duty of the ruling king is to give all protection to law-abiding persons and, and to chastise those who stray from the ordinances of the scriptures in ordinary times when there is no emergency. So Prabhu begins in the purport by talking about extraordinary happenings, mentioning Vishvamitra, who had to live on the flesh of dogs in extraordinary dangerous position. So normally one doesn't eat meat, but in extraordinary situations it's allowed, according to what Prabhu is saying here. Sometimes Prabhu would talk about people living in extraordinary situations, like people living in the desert and they're not able to grow any food. So there's one example there of, I think it's the Caspian Sea or the Sea of Galilee in the Bible when Jesus was present. And so the people in that area, the whole area is kind of desert, but there is a Sea of Galilee there, and they go out fishing. And so Prabhupada would mention that these kinds of circumstances are exceptional. Of course, you have like Eskimos in the Arctic regions, where you certainly can't grow anything there, any vegetables. So they're fishing and whatever. But in ordinary times, or in a situation where you can live without having to do that, one should not maintain slaughterhouses and kill innocent animals when you don't need to. You can live perfectly well without killing animals. So then one gets punished for that, one gets karma. So now they have thousands of animals killed, or millions of animals killed, and slaughterhouses, regular slaughterhouses. So this is not approved. The animals are suffering. The animals don't want to die, and the humans, they don't have to kill the animals. They have enough food. There's enough vegetables, enough grains, enough of everything there. There's no need for that. So it's simply ignorance of the pain that one is causing to others just to satisfy one's tongue. So there's reaction for that. Severe reaction for it. One cannot be happy by causing suffering to other living entities. Things don't work like that. So, of course, Prabhupada often mentioned one has to eat something, and vegetables are also living entities, but their consciousness is not as high as that of an animal. So, and then of course, the devotee offers his food to Krishna and becomes free from the reaction of taking the life of a vegetable. Of course, fruits, you don't take a life. Fruits are growing on the trees, apples, oranges, bananas, and all these. You're not taking a life there. So, and then in the second part of the purport, Prabhupada is talking about he's talking about regular scriptural injunctions for different persons engaged in different occupational duties. and one who follows them is called Swadharmasta, or faithful in one's prescribed duties. And Prabhupada mentions text 1848 in the Bhagavad Gita, it is advised that one should not give up his occupational prescribed duties, even if they are not always flawless. Such dharma might be violated in cases of emergency if one is faced in circumstances, but they cannot be violated in ordinary times. The state executive head is to see that such swadharma is not changed by the follower, whatever it may be, and he should give all protection to the follower of swadharma. The violator is subject to punishment in terms of the Shastra, and the duty of the king is to see that everyone strictly follows his occupational duty as prescribed in scripture. So, occupational duty is according to one's nature. In the Varnashram system, you have Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. And they have particular nature. The Brahmin is predominantly in the mode of goodness. The Kshatriya is in the mode of passion. The Vaishya is a combination of passion and ignorance. And the Shudra in ignorance. So they're working according to their nature. When one works according to his nature, his natural psychophysical makeup, when one does that, he's able to work in a peaceful, natural way because it's his nature. And he's able to be steady in his work. So, but then why would one act against one's nature? Why would one do that? Why would one act against one's nature? Well, obviously it goes on. And Krishna mentions in the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita, 3:35, Krishna says, it is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than in others' duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duty, for to follow another's path is dangerous. And then Prabhupada says, in the purport, one should therefore discharge his prescribed duties in full Krishna consciousness rather than those prescribed for others. Materially prescribed duties are duties enjoined according to one's psychophysical condition under the spell of the modes of material nature. Spiritual duties are as ordered by the spiritual master for the transcendental service of Krishna. But whether material or spiritual, one should stick to his prescribed duties, even up to death, rather than imitate another's prescribed duties. And that verse is also practically repeated word for word again in Bhagavad Gita. So that's like a verse, when something is repeated again, it's understood that it's extremely important. So it's repeated again. Does anyone know where else it's repeated again in Bhagavad Gita? Practically the same verse. This is 3:35. It's repeated in the 18th chapter, and it's the verse just before the one that Prabhupada quotes in the purport here. It's 1847. So I read 3:35 again. 3:35 is, it is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than another's duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. So that's 335. Now 1847. It is better to engage in one's own occupation, even though one may perform it imperfectly, than to accept another's occupation and perform it perfectly. Duties prescribed according to one's nature are never affected by sinful reactions. That's interesting, isn't it? Duties according to one's nature are not affected by sinful reaction. So if one acts against one's nature, there is sinful reaction. So that's why the Varnashram system is there, that people can work according to their nature and cooperatively in a peaceful way, so that people work, they can perform steady work, a steady occupation. Because otherwise, if one is not working according to one's nature, it goes against the grain. It's like it can cause stress and disturbance and unhappiness in so many ways. And now, of course, people are working. There's no real understanding of the modes of nature and how different people are situated in different modes of nature. There's no study of that. It's scientific. It's a psychological and physical makeup of a person, and he should be working according to that psychological and physical makeup, and not doing something else, which is going against the grain and causing unhappiness and disturbance. This is important for Krishna consciousness, because Prabhupada mentions in one place that in the third canto, he says that if one is not happy, it's not possible to make spiritual advancement. So a lot of this has to do with the development of the mode of goodness in society, because even though you might say like a Sudra is situated in the mode of ignorance by nature, when the focus is on the mode of goodness, the whole society is directed towards the mode of goodness, because it's directed by the head, which is the Brahmins. The Brahmins are actually in charge. They're in charge of the Kshatriyas. They're in charge of the Vaishyas. They're in charge. They're the head. They actually direct the whole society. So they're directing society, everyone, towards the mode of goodness, even though they may be situated in other modes. They're directing the society towards the mode of goodness by their instruction. The emphasis is on developing the mode of goodness, and it's also on developing love of God and surrender to Krishna. So the Brahmins, they don't kill, for example, a Brahmin. Although Prabhupada gives in the purport here, he does actually mention that sometimes a Brahmin may have to kill. The occupational duty of a Brahmin is certainly in the mode of goodness, but if a person is not by nature in the mode of goodness, he should not imitate the occupational duty of a Brahmin. For a Kshatriya or administrator, there are many abominable things. A Kshatriya has to be violent to kill his enemies, and sometimes a Kshatriya has to tell lies for the sake of diplomacy. Such violence and diplomacy accompany political affairs, but a Kshatriya is not supposed to give up his occupational duty and try to perform the duties of a Brahmin. but the prophet says then in 1848, the verse says, every endeavour is covered by some sort of fault, just as fire is covered by smoke. Therefore one should not give up the work born of his nature, O son of Kunti, even if such work is full of fault. So the prophet says, in a conditioned life, all work is contaminated by the material modes of nature. Even if one is a Brahmin, he has to perform sacrifices in which animal killing is necessary. Similarly, a Kshatriya, however pious he may be, has to fight enemies he cannot avoid it. Similarly, a merchant, however pious he may be, must sometimes hide his profit to stay in business, or he may sometimes have to do business on the black market. A lot of people listen to what? That's not right. But the fact is that there are different natures. And for a Brahmin to act like a Kshatriya, or a Brahmin to act like a Vaishya, can really go against the grain. There's one example of Bhaktivinoda Thakur in his biography. Can't remember exactly the details of this, but we know he was a magistrate, and that seemed to go with his nature relatively favourably enough. But there was some odd occupation he had, can't remember, there was another occupation he had, and it had to do with not being completely straight, basically, not being completely, there seemed to be some kind of duplicity involved in the type of occupation. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was very, very disturbed by it. And so he gave it up and became a magistrate. So then, but does that mean that nobody should do that occupation that he was doing? So somebody else would have taken over that occupation, and maybe that other person would have had a nature where they can do it, even if they have to be a little duplicitous or something. For some reason, it doesn't go against the grain because it's actually his nature. No? So so if somebody else was to do the same occupation, and Prabhu gives the example of a Vaishya dealing on the black market, for example, so he might do that to a certain extent, and it doesn't really bother him that much. Whereas if a Brahmin was to engage in the occupation and do the same and act the same way, he'd be completely disturbed. Totally, he just wouldn't be able to deal with it. It just goes against the grain. So that's why it's mentioned in the Bhagavatam that in times of emergency, a Brahmin can sometimes take the role of a Kshatriya, or sometimes the role of a Vaishya, but this is only for a temporary period of time in an emergency situation. But it says never the role of a Shudra. Brahmins, of course, we have an example of an emergency situation in which Brahmins sort of acted more like, not really like Brahmin, like, for example, in the account of King Vena in the Bhagavatam. He became a king, King Vena, and he was completely outrageous. And even when he was a child, he was killing other children. Somehow or other, he was doing this, and then he eventually became king, and he was just causing havoc in the state. And so the Brahmins spoke to him, and they said, you know, you're not behaving properly as a king, and you should be worshipping the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and you should be following religious principles, and you're not doing these things. And of course, what was his response? He says, I don't have to worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He said, I am the Supreme Personality of Godhead. You should be worshipping me. What are you sitting there telling me what to do? And so after some back and forth, the Brahmins concluded that if this person is allowed to rule anymore, the whole world is going to go to hell. And so they decided to kill him. So they killed him by, it sounds like, it says, describes like high sounding words, or by mantra. They killed him. So they just uttered a mantra, and that was the end of King Veda. Gone. So, but that was kind of out of, it wasn't a normal thing that Brahmins would do. So that was an exceptional situation, an emergency situation. And then, of course, they instated Maharaj Prithu afterwards. So emergency situations and then acting according to one's nature. In Kali Yuga, people find it very difficult to understand who they are, you know, and what they're supposed to be doing. It's a very bewildering situation. It's the nature of Kali Yuga and the nature of the lower modes of nature, passion and ignorance, that people become very, very bewildered, and they don't know what kind of occupation they should do, how they should be living. Everything becomes completely confused. But actually Prabhupada, though, he explains in 7th canto that in relation to Varnashram and establishing Varnashram, he does say that this is a very difficult thing to do in Kali Yuga, but by the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra, everything will become clear. Gradually everything will become clear, and people will understand what they have to do, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. They'll understand who they are, spiritually who they are, and materially who they are, psychologically who they are, and physically who they are. All this will become clear by chanting Hare Krishna. So, did Prabhupada act in emergency situations? I was thinking about that in relation to this. Is that Prabhupada certainly came into situations which were not like his normal living condition. We have an example that he was staying with one couple in New York, and Prabhupada had to put his boga in their fridge. And what else was in the fridge? Meat and whatever, maybe alcohol or what. And you know, so Prabhupada would just, it's like time and circumstance. Prabhupada had a mission to do, and he would do whatever it took for the greater good, to spread the message of Krishna consciousness. And sometimes he would even, there were situations where Prabhupada would encourage devotees to preach in communist countries. For example, there was Harikesh. He was preaching in communist countries, but he was telling Prabhupada how it was very difficult to get food there. They had all these queues, and we see that when Prabhupada was in Moscow with Shamasundra in 1971, I think it was. And Shamasundra was out all day trying to get some vegetables. A whole day out trying to get some vegetables. And queuing in different places. And then he'd come back with hardly anything. So, but later on, when devotees were preaching in communist countries and Eastern Europe, and Harikesh was preaching there, and initially he was talking about going there, and Prabhupada said to him, if you can't get food there or proper food, you can eat meat. And Harikesh said, what? He said, but Prabhupada, what about my consciousness? And Prabhupada said, damn your consciousness. So, of course, this is quite mind-boggling, really, isn't it? And I heard recently Romapad Swami talking about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati sending his disciples to London in the 1930s. And he said, if you can't eat properly, you can eat meat. He told them. And they didn't have to do that, actually. They were actually considering the situation, an emergency situation. These are pure devotees. So as far as they're concerned, this is an emergency situation. Because all these conditioned souls in Kali Yuga are all going to hell. And they had this incredible urgency in their makeup, a real urgency there, that we have to save all these fallen souls. And their mentality is, whatever we have to do it, we'll do it. Quite amazing, isn't it? But then you have to be very elevated to think like that. We're not Prabhupada, we're not Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Prabhupada also, he would, because of that kind of emergency mood of emergency, which was actually driven by compassion and love. That was what was driving this mood. Prabhupada would push his devotees like anything to get things done, to distribute books, and to develop projects. Look at what devotees went through in India, in Bombay, living on land, rat-infested land, and getting bitten by mosquitoes and coming down with all kinds of diseases and everything. And I was thinking of the example of Sarabi Abhipalayantam, who was Prabhupada's architect disciple. He was a very, very, very qualified, very good architect. And he completely surrendered to Prabhupada. But it was very, very intense what he had to achieve to construct the Bombay temple, the Vrindavan temple, the Mayapur temple. Sarabi was involved in all these. And it's described that it was very intense for him, very, very intense. And there was all kinds of cheating going on with the suppliers, and he had to try and get cement, and there was restrictions with the government, and he was going without sleep, for long periods of time. And then I remember reading when the Vrindavan temple was finished, after the devotees, and particularly Sarabi, went through absolutely incredible austerities to achieve this. And so Prabhupada went and he looked at the temple, and the devotees were with Prabhupada, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj was there, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj said to Prabhupada, "Oh, Sarabi has done very well." And Prabhupada said, "Yes." He said, "But my duty is to chastise him. He's my disciple." So, but Prabhupada was walking around the temple and looking, and he said, "It is heaven on earth." But Sarabi, he actually left Krishna consciousness. You can understand, though, things were so intense. He had so much work to do that it was very difficult for him to perform proper sadhana. Now, one could say that, it's a devotee's responsibility to take care of a sadhana first. But somehow or other, Krishna put him in a situation where he was like an instrument in Prabhupada's hands. And he had a job to do for Krishna. And he did it very well. But it seems like his sadhana suffered, quite a lot. And he left Krishna consciousness. He went and he lived in Hong Kong, and he got married, and his wife wasn't a devotee. And he had some business there. And then, and he was away for a long time. And then he got cancer and he was dying, and his wife brought him to Vrindavan, even though she wasn't a devotee. And she said to the devotees, "I've brought him home." So he left his body in Vrindavan. What more do you want? Huh? So you can understand where he went. So those situations are there. At the same time, we have to understand that Krishna consciousness takes time, and we have a lifetime to dedicate to Krishna consciousness. So, in a general sense, we can't be living in emergency situations all the time. Prabhupada would actually, he made this point also, and that was his general point, that, he would look at this society and say, people are running around, they're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, driving to work. He said, this is crazy. This is a crazy, chaotic situation that people are living in. Shouldn't be like that. You should be able to get up peacefully, take your shower, get ready, and chant your rounds and do sadhana and everything, and live a peaceful life, not running around like a maniac all the time. So that was actually Prabhupada's. Prabhupada made a very, very strong point on that, and he wanted farm communities and devotees living in the country, living in a peaceful life, and he would say, and have enough time to chant Hare Krishna. Not that people are running around, they have no time to think of God, to talk about God, to chant Hare Krishna or anything. He said, make time to chant Hare Krishna. So that was there. Initially, in the beginning, Prabhupada was pushing, and there were, he was, but that wasn't his overall long-term view of things. So he wanted devotees to develop love for Krishna, to develop the mode of goodness, and he would encourage devotees to work according to their nature, because that's what people do naturally, and chant Hare Krishna and develop love for Krishna and go back to Godhead. Any comments or questions?
So, does her occupation mainly determine like what class we belong to, or should we even like bother about that? Because like if you're practicing devotion, like everybody's like doing their sadhana, chanting and everything. So the only thing that would be different is like what occupation one does, right? So does that determine like if you are like Brahmana, Kshatriya, Shudra, like Vaishnava? Is that what it is? Like, should we even like try to identify who we are, or not?
Well, you know, if we're engaged in Krishna consciousness, if we're chanting and we're hearing, and it'll become clear what we're supposed to be doing. So we don't need to worry, you know, artificially. We don't need to kind of artificially trying to figure things out. It should come in a natural way. Krishna will engage us in Krishna consciousness. The more we chant, the more we hear, the more we serve, Krishna will make it more and more clear what we're supposed to be doing. It'll become clear to us. So yeah, as you say, we don't actually need to worry about it. It'll become clear. Because you can't artificially figure these things out anyway. You know, Kali Yuga is there's so much a predominance of the modes of ignorance and passion. So, you know, for some it may be very clear what you're supposed to be doing, but not necessarily for everyone. But so just chant Hare Krishna and don't worry about it.
So if we are like thinking of living in farm communities, is Varnashrama one of the things that like, you know, communities would focus on, or like not?
Well, Prabhu did emphasize Varnashram. So yeah, there will be things that as things develop, it'll become clear, you know, who has a Brahminical tendency, who has a tendency for cow protection, who has a tendency to be a Kshatriya, you know, all those tendencies will become clear, and people will just, devotees will just do what they do and be happy and chant Hare Krishna. And they will just cooperate with each other and get on with it. So, yeah, it's like that. All these city situations are very artificial, and you know, we're kind of stuck in situations like that. But as devotees become purified, more and more we'll understand the proper direction to take. Anything else? Okay, Srimad Bhagavatam Ki.
Yeah.
Srila Prabhupada Ki.
Jai.